So our app is looking pretty nice, but up till now, there's always been a really serious bug that we haven't yet discovered in our app. Now, if you've been playing around with the app quite a bit, you might have discovered this bug already. But if you haven't, let me show you what it is. Now, I'm going to add a whole bunch of new items into our item array so that when I run my app, I'm going to have more than 3 cells. In fact, I'm going to have more cells than the table view can possibly display. So when I scroll, you can see that even though the table view is at J, if I keep going, it goes all the way down to O, right? So now, if I click on the first cell and it checks the first cell, and I scroll down to the bottom, you can see that for some bizarre reason, our cell that's called N is also checked. And if I uncheck it and I scroll back, my first cell is no longer checked. So what on earth is going on here? And what is happening with all this strange behavior? Well, the answer to this lies in the fact that table view cells gets reused. And that's what this line means when we're calling DQ reusable cell, right? We're saying that go and find that prototype cell called to-do item cell inside main.storyboard and generate a whole bunch of it that we can reuse. So that means when the first cell gets rolled off the table view and it's no longer visible, it actually goes all the way around and comes back underneath as a new reusable cell. So how can we prove that this is true? Do you remember last time when I asked you as a challenge, why is it that we need this tableview.dq reusable cell method instead of something like let cell equals a new object of type UI table view cell, and we say the style is, say, default, reuse identifier is the same as we've got here, so that reusable prototype cell that we had. I'm just going to comment that out and let's run it. Now, if I check the first object and I scroll my table view until my cell disappears off the screen and I pull it back, you'll see that that check mark has disappeared. And that's because the checking or unchecking, I'm setting a property on the cell. And once the cell disappears off the screen, it gets deallocated and destroyed. And when I scroll it back, I'm actually getting a brand new cell that's getting this message put in. Now, on the other hand, say if I use DQ reusable cell, then in this case, when I check the first cell, I scroll it up, and at the point when that cell disappears off the screen, it comes around the table view and gets reinitialized at the bottom as a new table view cell. And because it's being reused, that property, that checked accessory, is still present here. And that's why we're getting this rather odd behavior. It's because we're reusing our cells. So we found the problem, and the problem is that we need to associate a property, not with the cell, but with our data. So in order for us to assign a check mark or no check mark to each of these items, we need a way to be able to associate each item with a property, checked or unchecked. Now, how can we do that? We certainly can't do it using just a plain old array, but if you pause the video and have a think about how you can associate a property with each of these items and see if you can come up with the solution. All right, so some of the solutions that you guys might have thought of were maybe instead of using an array, is maybe to use a dictionary where you can have key value pairs. Or, and a much better solution, would be creating a model. And we've spoken about MVC in the past when we did Quizlet. Now this is another scenario where you start to see the beauty and the reasons why we need to start separating our models, our views, and our controllers. So let's go ahead and build a data model where each of our items are objects that can have properties, including the title of the item, and also a done or not done Boolean. So this is a good time point to pause the video and build a new class called item, which we can use to store two properties. One property is a string called title, which is where we're going to save the titles of our to-dos. And the other one is called done, which is a Boolean property where we're going to save whether if the item was checked off or not. So pause the video and give that a go. All right, so let's go over to File, New File, and let's create a brand new Swift file. Hit Next. We're going to call our file item, and we're going to put our item into its own folder, so a new group from selection. And the folder is going to be called Data Model. And we'll make a new group with our to-do list view controller, and we'll call it controllers. And we'll also, while we're at it, might as well put main.storyboard into a views folder. All right, and finally, I'm just going to put the assets and the launch screen together as a group, and I'll call it supporting files. That just gets rid of it and declutters and makes our structure a little bit more clear. All right, let's head into item, and we're going to create a new class that's called item. Now, of course, you don't actually have to name your class the same as the file name, but in 99.999 recurring cases, everybody does this, and it will be very, very odd if these two are not the same, and it's very confusing. So try to keep these two exactly the same. Okay, so we'll have a property called title, and this is going to be a string. And by default, we'll say it's just an empty string. And then we're going to create another property called done. And this is going to be a Boolean. And by default, all items will start off as being not done. So we'll set that as false. So let's go ahead and hit save and go back to our to-do list view controller. And we can start creating some of these items. So I'm just going to comment out this line. And I'm going to create a new item, and I'm going to use our item class to do that. And our new item is a new object of the type item, and new item.title is going to be equal to this. And instead of having an array of hard-coded string objects, I'm going to turn this item array into an array of item objects. And so none of what we've done so far should be new to you, because we've done all of this and more inside Quizlet. So if you're at all confused about MVC or models, views, controllers, then be sure to have a look back at the Quizlet module where we go into this in much more detail. So now we can say item array dot append, and we're going to append the new element, which is called new item. So I'm just going to go and copy and paste this for time's sake, and I'm going to amend the code so that we end up with new item 2 and new item 3. In addition to that, in order for our code to work, we need to fix it in a couple of places, because we're changing from an array of strings to an array of item objects. So if we go down here, item array.count is still valid because we have an array that has this property .count. Doesn't matter if it's an array of strings or an array of objects. But this part where we set the cell text label .text property, we need to change, because item array at index path row is going to return an item object. And what we need to do is we actually need to tap into its title property using the dot notation. And we also need to change the code where we're adding new items. So here, where we're saying self.itemarray.append textfield.text, that doesn't really work. Instead, we have to create a new item that is of the class item. And we're going to say new item dot title equals textfield.text. And then we can say self.itemarray append, and the thing that we append is now going to be our new item. And now if we hit run, let's see what happens. So our app is now working using item objects instead of a hard-coded array, but we still haven't fixed our checkmark problem because we haven't yet changed the done property when we toggle the checkmark. Also, we've not updated the code for our add button yet. In fact, if you click on the add button now, the app will crash. But let's do one thing at a time. Let's fix the done property first, and we'll tackle the add button in one of the upcoming lessons. So inside did select row at index path, let's set the property of the selected item. So we can tap into item array, and we can tap into the item at index path dot row, i.e. the current item object that's selected. And we can set the done property to equal the opposite of what it used to be. So if it used to be false, then we want to change it to true. And if it used to be true, then we want to change it to false. Now, the long way of doing this is by saying if item array at index path dot row dot done equals false, then in that case, we want to set the item array at index path dot row dot done to true. Otherwise, we're going to say item array at index path dot row dot done equals false. And that sorts out the toggling, right? And we can add a bit of code to our self of row at index path, which, if you remember, is the delegate method that figures out how we should display each of the cells. And we can say if item array at index path dot row dot done equals true, then in that case, we're going to set the cell dot accessory type to equal checkmark, and otherwise we're going to set the cell dot accessory type to equal none. So that means we can get rid of these 3 lines of code. Now our code is incredibly wordy at the moment, but it's good to have it like this when we can test it and see if it works before we start refactoring and making things look a bit simpler and cutting down our lines of code. So now when we select our cells, you can see that we've actually broken our app, because while it's selecting and deselecting, it's not changing the checkmark one bit. Now, why might that be? The reason is because self of row at index path is called initially when the table view gets loaded up. And at that time point, none of our items are done. So none of them get an accessory mark. Say if we changed one of these, let's make the first one, for example, new item dot done equals true, then you can run your app and confirm to yourself that your code is actually working. This part, where we say if item array index path dot row is done, then make the check mark, it's working, because you can see when we first load up our app, you see that check mark there. So the problem that we have to solve then is, how do we get this delegate method to trigger again once we've changed the item's done property? So the magical method here is TableView.reloadData. And we've seen this before, and we've used it before in FlashChat. But what it basically does is that it forces the table view to call its data source methods again so that it reloads the data that's meant to be inside. So if we go ahead and put a print statement here, cell for row at index path called, you can see that it got called 3 times, iterating through our array of items when the table view first loaded up. And now when I select one of these cells and I trigger the did select row delegate method, and we've set our done properties, and we get to this line where it says TableView.reloadData, then we're going to see it called a couple more times. So watch as I select one of these. And you can see that we've got 3 more printouts of self-row at index path because the table view is refreshed and it's called that delegate method self-row at index path 3 more times for every single item we have in our array. And now our check marks also work, right? Brilliant. So now let's check and make sure that we've solved that bug that we had earlier on. So if we go underneath the 3 items that we carefully initialized and appended, I'm going to paste in just a whole bunch of appends of our new item 3 to the end of our item array. And that just adds way more items so that we can actually fill up our table view. So now, say if I check these first 2 cells and I scroll down to the bottom, you can see that we no longer have that cell reuse problem. And it's because in every single one of these cells, we're checking to see what is the done property for each item, and we're displaying the check mark depending on what that property is, whether if it's true or false. So now that we've confirmed we've solved that bug, let's go back and refactor our code. And I'm going to get rid of all of this. Let's go back and refactor our code so that everything is more succinct. So the first thing that I want to change is all of this. And this is very, very inelegant. And I'll show you why. Because instead of doing all of this, what I could have said is item array at indexPath.row.done property equals the opposite of item array at indexPath.row.done. So that single line replaces all of these, 5 lines of code, and it does exactly the same thing. It sets the done property on the current item in the item array to the opposite of what it is right now. If it's true, it becomes false. If it's false, it becomes true. And it's all using this not operator, basically reversing what it used to be. Because Booleans can only have 1 or 2 states, true or false. So if we put the not true, then it becomes false. If we put not false, then it becomes true. So we can go ahead and delete all of that. Now, the next thing that I want to address is I'm going to delete these 2 lines because we don't need it anymore. And here, instead of using item array indexPath.row so many times, I'm just going to create a new constant called item, and I'm going to set it to equal item array at indexPath.row. So this item is now the item that we're currently trying to set up for the cell. So then instead of writing this, I can simply write item.title. And instead of writing this, I can simply write item.done. But we can go even further than that to make this bit of code a lot shorter and a lot more elegant. And in order to do that, we're going to use the ternary operator. And this is, again, something that's not unique to Swift. It's seen in a lot of programming languages, but it's a really neat way of cutting down some code when we don't want to be so wordy. So to learn all about the Swift ternary operator, I will see you on the next lesson.